them so folks know. The first one is SB number 515. The second one is SB 1405. The third is SB 1406. And the fourth one is SB 1407. The fifth one is SB 1409. The sixth one is SB number 7093. And the seventh one is 7089. So we've got a lot of interesting bills here. I did want to give my co-chair, she is running a few minutes late, so she will join. But in the room, I think I saw Senator Sampson. Would you like to have any opening remarks?
I appreciate the thought, but it's Representative Vail.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm actually going to defer to my House ranking member, Representative Carney. I see you online. Would you like to have any opening remarks before we kick off the public hearing?
Nothing much. Just looking forward to hearing from SEEK and about ways they might be able to improve. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We've had some issues with transportation this morning, so a lot of us are online and trying to juggle several meetings at one time. With that, we're going to go ahead and kick off the testimony. The first group on the agenda is going to be SEEK. Would you like to come up and start and introduce yourself, please?
We've submitted written testimony regarding the two repeat proposals.
Hi, I'm sorry I missed. If you don't mind introducing yourself and giving us some background, that would be great. I don't know if it just cut out for a second or and I missed it. If you don't mind, please.
Yes, of course. Good morning. I'm Shannon Keefe, and I'm speaking on behalf of the State Elections Enforcement Commission. On the agenda is items 5 through 7 are proposals we recommended. We've submitted written testimony on 2 of them, which are repeat proposals. House Bill 7089 is a new proposal, and I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to talk to you today about how this bill offers adjustments that will make the program easier to participate in for treasurers, more fair for candidates, and easier to understand for the regulated community. The first set of changes just provides a simple clarification of terms to clear up some confusion caused by the defined terms in the statute. Solicitor and solicit are both defined, but one who solicits is not necessarily a solicitor. The proposal would rename solicitor as collector, thereby ending the confusion. Section 6 and 7 will make a CEP treasurer's job much easier. Within the CEP, the treasurers perform the absolutely critical oversight function with respect to public funds. During the 2024 cycle, we gave out over $14 million to General Assembly candidates. And it was the treasurers who ensured that these monies were used only to pay for permissible expenditures, that payments were good for goods and services were not in excess of the usual and normal charges, that there was transparency and accountability through public reporting, and that the expenditure limits were upheld. When a committee chooses to use a consultant, sometimes the information and documentation needed by the treasurer to perform these duties is within the consultant rather than the treasurer. This proposed language allows liability for consultants who receive a certain amount of the public funds but fail to provide treasurers the documents they need to do their job. This will make a CEP treasurer's oversight role infinitely easier. This bill also puts back into the law a type of organization expenditure that has existed in the CEP since the beginning of the program. It allows the party to support candidates while still requiring that the candidates do their own fundraising in order to demonstrate that they have the public support of those they will represent. In 2023, the language allowing this was eliminated from statute, and that created a great deal of confusion for 2024. We're hoping that you will put that language back in. Finally, this bill would clear up some problems that are created by the timing of the consumer price indexing with respect to, one, the qualifying contribution amount, and also, two, the qualifying threshold required to apply for a grant. So as currently enacted, the new gubernatorial committee grants for convention campaigns can be received before you have ballot access. Those applying before January of the election year will only have to raise $250,000, while those who apply after January 15th of the election year will have to raise well over $327,000, more than a $77,000 differential. The timing of the consumer price indexing for General Assembly and other statewide candidates also creates problems for those that begin fundraising before the adjustments. Refunds and participation in pre-application reviews become an issue for treasurers, and they're forced to fundraise in waves. This proposal fixes all of that. It changes the timing of adjustments only for the amounts candidates are required to raise and the contribution amount. It does not change the timing of adjustments for the amounts of money that they receive. It allows candidates to file their CEP Form 10 earlier so they can avoid the Hobbesian choice of risking a complaint that they are fundraising above the non-participating limits or filing an early intent to abide that could later prevent their candidate from receiving a grant should they change their path to ballot access. Sections 8 and 10 of SEEK's proposal in House Bill 7089 address similar issues as Senate Bill 515 and lines 278 to 331 in Section 7 of House Bill 1405. We support these options as well. They address the same problems or part of them. Our fix is just more complete. There's some ideas like keeping the amount the same until the next one comes that isn't in ours. It could be combined into ours. But those don't fix the problem for the statewide or the fact that treasurers have to fundraise in waves. So that we're hoping you'll consider carefully the proposal that we've made. It's based on a lot of experience with running the program and a true desire to make things easier for the treasurers and more fair for the candidates participating in the program. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about any of our three proposals.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your testimony today. I did have some questions, but I wanted to offer my committee an opportunity to go first if you have any questions. Is there anyone in the room that has questions? I can't see. I don't see anybody raising their hand, so I'm going to jump in. Again, thank you so much for your presentation today. That was really helpful. We've had a number of sort of questions kind of in general, and I was hoping you could kind of speak about some of these things. The first is to talk about the amounts raised and the dollar amount for each candidate. And there have been some other proposals on the agenda that allow increases to the minimum amount based on inflation and consumer price index. Can you talk about the sort of limit and how SEEK determines in each election cycle the dollar limits for each candidate? Thank you.
Sure. So in 2017, consumer price indexing was put into the statute for the amount of the qualifying contribution as well as the threshold that candidates have to raise up to. We calculate that based on a number that's released by the federal government in December of the year before the election. As soon as those numbers come out, usually in mid-January, we quickly calculate what the new amount is and we release that. The way the statute's currently written, until that date when we are able to get the numbers that we need to calculate the change in the grant, they remain what they were at base levels under the statute. So since 2017, it's been $250 for a qualifying contribution. And then I think it was $5,000 for state rep as a threshold, 15,000 originally from, these are numbers that were released in 2008. And then those numbers have been adjusted, or sometimes the legislature chooses to ask us not to adjust them and to use the numbers from the adjustment 2 years ago. So for example, in 2022, the threshold for the Senate was 17,300. It would have raised by a couple $100, except that during the legislative session right before, we were asked to keep the amount that was used for 2022 for the 2024 cycle. So we respond to the legislation as it's written and the instructions that the legislature has given us each cycle. But generally speaking, it goes back to the 250 and the thresholds in the statute until we do the adjustment in January. So last cycle, we proposed, and I think it was passed in a House amendment, we actually thought it had passed, that we would move that adjustment back until October because we looked at all of the fundraising and when people were getting into committees, and it seemed like nobody really started raising until October, right when they were finishing up the last cycle. So we thought if we made the adjustment then, that would be soon enough for people. But there are some committees that tend to get into it right after the General Assembly election again. And so when we looked at it this year, we realized that there really is a trend of people opening their committees earlier and earlier. And so our proposal this year is that the adjustment would happen right after the last General Assembly election. So there would be a vote in November, and then we would adjust based on the December numbers and you would know what the qualifying contribution amount would be and what your threshold that you needed to raise would be for the entire 2 years. We just feel like that creates less of a difficulty for the treasurer to have that certainty. It would also have a couple benefits for us because we have these pre-application reviews where people can come in if they've raised the required amount and they know and we're able to tell them everything that we'll look at when they come in June and give them a chance to make fixes early. Campaigns that do that get their grants right away generally when they come in then, as soon as they get ballot access. But candidates don't know what the threshold is until January, and we start doing them in February. So it would be much easier to participate, know what you had to be reaching towards if we did it at the beginning of the cycle. And again, what we're really adjusting, the biggest swing is the amount that you have to raise. So that would be less than if we raise it the following January, 2 or 3% less. So I think it's that differential between the adjustment for what we give on the grant and what candidates are required to fundraise is justified by the confusion that it's causing the treasurers. And it also would prevent treasurers from having to raise in waves, up to whatever the limit was. Even if you did the proposals that are in those lines in Senate Bill or House Bill 1405 that I mentioned, or in Senate Bill 515, you still can only go up to a certain amount that was for last year. And then once you know the amount in January, you have to ask again. If we adjusted at the beginning of the 2-year cycle, then you know what you're asking and you only have to make one ask. And some treasurers would very much prefer to do it that way. So we wanted to facilitate that. And then, of course, there's the whole other issue now of the statewide campaigns with their grants. I think gubernatorial candidates will be really surprised and upset if their opponents are only having to raise 250,000 and they're having to raise, 75, 70, $80,000 more, depending on what the adjustments end up being. So we spent a long time looking at that statute and kind of carefully crafting a fix for that will work for 2026. If the legislation is passed in June, and also for 2030 going forward. I think the only other thing in the bill that's important to understand is the changing of being able to file your Form 10 early and let us know how you're planning on participate. As the House grant for non-participating remains at 250,000 and the participating grant continues to climb, it becomes less and less clear which rules apply to the committees. And they're in this really difficult choice of having to declare which it is to make it clear to their opponents that they're not violating the law, or risking losing access to the grant because they misunderstood what their path to the ballot would be. So all this does is change a single provision to be triggered on a Form 10, which you can file, which you'd be able to file at any time. But now, practically speaking, you have to file only after you know how you're going to be on the ballot. The provision remains in the law. It just changes to being triggered on the Form 15, which is done when you apply for a grant, which for the House and Senate is when you absolutely know how you've gotten on the ballot.
That's helpful. So it sounds like to me from what you're saying, that Senate Bill 515 wouldn't be something that you would go down because it's already, sounds like it's already done that way. And so maybe I'm a little confused. Can you please comment on Senate Bill 515?
Sure. Senate Bill 515, what it does is it says that right now so in 2022, in January of 2022, we adjusted the grant amount for the 2022 cycle only to $320. And then but for the 2024 cycle, anybody who was raising before January of 2024 could only raise $250 and be in compliance with the law. They couldn't go up to the $350 that might have been the adjustment for 2024, right? So what this bill does, Senate Bill 515, is it says once you adjust to 320, you can raise 320 until the next adjustment is made, and then you can raise 350. But so that's a good thing to do. That's fine, but it doesn't stop the fact that the treasurers don't know what they have to raise when they begin raising it. If they raise 350, they have to refund back to 320 versus 250, but it doesn't change the need for refunds. And the other thing, it's going to go out of cycle with the way that exploratory committee fundraising works soon. And that will become an issue. So this would prevent that from happening in 2030 when we start reaching levels that go over the exploratory limit. So it's a fine thing to do, and you could include it with our proposal if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be necessary if you did the more complete fix.
Got it. So I think I understand now, and apologies. Was just trying to kind of reconcile the two. So an implementation of 515 sounds like it result in issues where you might need to refund later if the SEEK adjustment wasn't in the same line. Is that correct? But am I hearing that from you?
It depends on how much the treasurers raise. It just allows them to raise up to what was gotten last time. So it just changes the limit of what they raise before the adjustment is made in January of the election year. That's all it does. So it fixes a very, very small part of the much larger problem that's caused by the timing of the consumer price indexing.
Okay, that's helpful. I actually had another sort of general question that I have received, and I know there's some other questions I see coming up. But one of the questions I received from a treasurer who has managed both Senate campaigns and House campaigns is how is the total amount of the grant calculated in terms of each race? So if you don't mind just kind of giving a little background for the public so that they understand when SEEK sets the grant amount, how that is done in relation to the race involved.
So it's basically the same thing. It's a flat grant amount is in the statute that's been unchanged since 2008. And then there are provisions in the statute that tell us starting on this year, you're going to adjust that by the consumer price index differential. So right now, it's the same timing in January of the election year. We take a certain amount of time that's defined in statute, so it might be, I know for qualifying contributions, we begin with December 2017, the date that's issued at the end of December 2017, and then we take the number that's issued at the end of December of the year before the election year. And we see what the difference is, and that gives us a percentage, and we multiply that percentage by the base grant amount, and that gives you your new grant amount.
Got it. Okay. That's really helpful. I hadn't appreciated that. It was because I was kind of looking in proportion to the number of constituents or the size of the race, the number of towns and things like that. And like in results to the number of mailers somebody might have to do for a Senate campaign and why it wasn't quite as proportionately allocated. So that sounds like a more historical problem or issue. That's really helpful. I wanted you also to ask I wanted to ask some questions on 1405, the one that modifies the campaign finance laws and the powers. So we talked a little bit in regards to how links might be shared from a campaign by town committees, other sort of leadership packs and things like that. And then it talks a little bit about advertising and then the need for disclaimers, whether it's in a text or an audio message. Was hoping that you could comment a little bit on that aspect of that bill.
We actually have a whole other set of testimony on those bills. Would you like us to give that first, and then we can ask the questions after?
Actually, that would be great, but why don't I defer to my ranking member, Representative Carney, who may have a question on your original bills, and then we can have a discussion on the other bills.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually had some questions on the other bills too. So I don't know if you want me to go ahead with those or.
Why don't we let them testify on those bills? And I understand that Senator Gagcar Wilcox is in the meeting, and I might have her, since she's in the room, take over chairing, and we can have that testimony and then kind of revert back to questions. Does that sound good? Senator, would you like to say a few opening remarks and then take off the next part of the hearing?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much to my wonderful co-chair and Representative Dathan for stepping in. Apologize for being late. I was giving a midterm, and today is the one day that also on top of it gets stuck in traffic. So I rushed them even out of the midterm, but it was for constitutional law, so that should be a good thing. But anyway, I appreciate the indulgence, and I think this is a good plan. Why don't we let you complete the testimony, and then we can ask questions on all the bills after that. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we decided to split up the bills and kind of along the lines of the ones we support and the ones we oppose, and these are ones that we oppose. My name is Joshua Foley. I'm a attorney at the Elections Commission, and these bills that I'm talking about, which are 1405, 1406, and 1407, are ones that we are opposing. Senate Bill 1405 would allow, among other things, any committee, including special interest PACs, to make content and solicit for CEP candidates, allowing them to essentially coordinate fundraising. This would make it easier to receive large public grants of money with less demonstration of public support and with the help of special interests, contrary to the program's intent. It may do other things, but this is in addition what it does. The bill reduces the number of mandatory audits for candidate committees from 50% to 20%. When the program began, we were required to audit 100% of committees, and with good reason. It is imperative to assure the public that CEP funds are not being misspent. This continues a troubling trend of reducing transparency and oversight of publicly funded expenditures. The bill limits our ability to give guidance when it might be needed most during election season. It is a legitimate concern that an agency would make some disruptive policy reversal immediately before an election. But the solution is not to take away or censor our independent voice to give nonpartisan expert advice when it might be needed most, whether it's because of external events like court decisions or other unforeseen circumstances. The bill would require us to allow the most questionable contributions to qualify as part of a grant application, even when those contributions are insufficiently documented or potentially illegal. Again, it mandates us to do less oversight. Finally, it strips away from our independent bipartisan commission its most important and essential power, the ability to hire and fire the head of the agency. Instead, this bill grants the legislature the ability, at least every 4 years, to fire our executive director without cause and veto any new hire. Senate Bill 1406 would allow partisan entities like Act Blue, for example, to algorithmically fundraise for every party-aligned candidate using the platform. This just further deteriorates the integrity of the CEP in multiple ways. The bill does add staff to the SEEK, which would be welcome, but this increase in staff is likely tied to the proposal to dramatically increase the jurisdiction of SEEK to include special tax districts. It is difficult to stress this enough. We have no way of knowing what this expansion would entail from a work standpoint, from a resource standpoint, or from a legal standpoint. It is possible that at the end of the day, such an expansion of the SEEK's jurisdiction is determined to be appropriate and sensible, but to do it without any study or consultation is inadvisable. Lastly, Senate Bill 1407 mandates that we complete audits in 1 year without any additional audit personnel. Of course, we would like to resolve audits more quickly, and we are always endeavoring to do so. However, our audit staff is also tasked with processing grant applications, and there are mandatory turnaround times for that too. We've proposed an alternate solution in our written testimony. In conclusion, these bills on a whole degrade our independence and weaken our campaign finance program without a commensurate public benefit, so we strongly oppose them. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on those bills.
Great, thank you very much. So perhaps we can take questions on all the bills at this point. And I have a couple of questions initially, and then maybe I can turn it over. I know Representative Carney, or why don't I turn it, because Representative Carney had questions from the other bills as well. So why don't I turn it over to Representative Carney for questions, and then I see Representative Dathan, and then I'll ask mine at the end. And Representative Vail. Representative Carney, do you want to proceed with your questions? Might have stepped away from it. Representative Dathan?
Sure. Thank you so much again. I just was going to try to talk a little bit about the number of audits and the total sort of procedures you're doing. I understand, I'd like to understand how much, how many hours is a full audit that you do, and what sort of procedures are you doing for your standard sort of audits that you do?
I think the amount of time that any given audit takes depends on the quality of the documentation that the treasurers give. Some treasurers do a great job, give us everything very well organized and clean. And those take much less time than the ones where the treasurers give us just a beginning amount, and then we have to go through asking them for the bank statements, basic documents, and we go through rounds of asking them so that we can get to the point where we can write the draft. As far as an average amount of time for the House or the Senate audits, I could get that for you from the Director of Audit. I don't have that right now.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, when I look and I kind of think about the audits coming from that sort of background, I want to understand how you are ascertaining like completeness of transactions, accuracy of transactions. It's all great. I think there's some issues that we have that I have heard, particularly on the contribution side, like if someone's retired, or they're older and you say they're just retired, to come back and have further questions about what sort of work have they done in the past, or other sort of clarifying information. I think that adds to the sort of work that the treasurer has to do. And also ensuring that, all the documents are in place and having everything organized. I know, speaking to so many people in the House, for example, they have a hard time finding a treasurer because the amount of work has gone up so substantially in the last several cycles, that a lot of people are kind of not wanting to do it. And so what I'm trying to understand is how we can ensure that the monies are used in the right way, and authorized in the right way, but also ensuring that the treasurer is able to report and do everything on time for you all for these audits. And I know when some of these things are dragging on, it is really hard for the potential treasurer to go on to the next race if they've been dragging on for several years. And I think that was the intention, to be able to complete them in a faster way. And it sounds like you're opposed to doing less audits, which I understand. But then, at the same time, there is ways that we could potentially do less audits and still have assurance over the number of transactions, and ensuring that all of the completeness and accuracy of all of the audits have been maintained. So I'd like to kind of think about that a little bit. One of the ideas that was put forward about the looking at various like fire districts and other sort of committees, I guess, maybe the question is, how many of these actually file for referendums or other sort of things on average per year, that we're talking about, if you have those numbers.
No, we do not. I did some preliminary research, I think, after I spoke with you a few weeks ago. It's actually very difficult to ascertain the number of special tax districts. I found an article from 2022 that suggests there's 433 special tax districts in Connecticut. By contrast, there's 169 towns. Each special tax district might have its own bylaws, ordinances, charter. They may have, like some towns, by ordinance or by charter, an annual budget referendum that they do every June to establish a tax rate and to allocate the funds. We don't have a central repository for information about how many of those happen, or even even a snapshot of what each special tax district looks like legally speaking, much less what their their modus operandi is for having referenda or elections or the offices that they have. It's a real black box that, you know, would be curious to know about ourselves. We don't generally get a lot of questions about the referenda or elections that take place in special tax districts. And when we do, we kind of defer because there's not much we can do for the types of processes that they're going through, because a lot of them aren't actually elections at all under our definition. And but sometimes the referenda will come to us, or the referendum spenders will come to us, and we'll advise them how to spend money and disclose the money appropriately, which isn't, you know, a big heavy lift for us. But the most troubling thing is we don't know what we don't know.
So what is the complaint process if somebody does have an issue in one of those sort of elections? You had mentioned you have given advice to folks if there are questions that come up along the way, but I don't understand the sort of how, if there was a question or a complaint that was coming up in one of those, how would that be handled currently under our current statutes?
Well, it depends entirely on the facts of the complaint. In some cases, we can help them and docket the complaint. In some cases, we can't. Usually, you know, when somebody complains about something, they're complaining that somebody's not following the rules. And the question is, what rules? Is it the rules in Title IX, you know, about how all elections are conducted? If they are, then we're happy to like docket that complaint and look and see if those rules are violated. But oftentimes they're complaining that the rules of the bylaws of the municipal corporation or the special tax district corporation weren't followed. You know, that's not something that our agency is equipped or allowed to look at, you know, the special bylaws of these districts and then interpret what they mean. And then also whether or not these procedures that they're going through are actually elections at all. By statute, elections are defined as a vote of electors. That's a defined term that takes place at a tabulating machine on pre-printed ballots. It's very specific and granular about what is an actual election. These elections at special tax districts could be like a raising of hands at a meeting. And the electors might not be involved at all. They might be just property owners in the special tax district, which could be humans or corporations or LLCs or you know, family trusts. They're not even people often. So we have to like look at these facts, and if we can help the people who do, and if we can't, we have to say, you know, your only remedy is to go to court, which is something that they don't want to hear, of course, because it's going to cost them money. But the Superior Court would be able to adjudicate those things when we cannot. And I know that's a very unsatisfying answer, but as it is, that's their recourse.
Okay, I kind of understand what you're saying there. With the 1405, I'm trying to find your testimony on that one. So I'm going to ask the chair if I can come back as I find my question for that one.
Sure, it will come back.
Thank you.
We'll come back to you, Representative Dathan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few questions. Actually, I need to put these back on. All right, so I want to address the consumer price index. So it affects is my understanding, affects three different categories. The maximum amount an individual can contribute, what our minimum amount of contributions is, correct? That will increase with it.
Your threshold,
And does it-
fundraising threshold.
Yes. And then does it also affect the amount that committees can donate to campaigns as well?
No,
So-
that is not.
Well,
Because that
Oh, is
number
that
has changed. Like,
the
so,
organization expenditures, you mean?
no, I'm telling you,
Oh.
like, there's, which I don't necessarily agree with, but like, a town committee can spend up to X amount of dollars on these campaigns as well. They wouldn't donate the money, but they can have certain expenditures. And I know the numbers when I started were a $100 max contribution. I know they changed to $250 and then it went up with the index. And it was 5,000 we had to raise, and I believe it was 3,500 was the amount that, up to 3,500
For the organization.
for the
expenditure.
organization.
Yeah.
And so does that number also increase with, the
And the
consumer
grant
price index?
amount. So there's four things. There's the organization expenditure amount, which is the 3,500 that you're talking about. And that's the amount that party committees, legislative leadership, and caucus committees can spend to assist their candidates. And then there's the amount of the grant itself, how much you get when you qualify. There's the contribution amount that you're allowed to ask for. And then there's the threshold that you have to meet in order to qualify for a grant with those contributions. So those four things go up.
And you evaluate those every 2 years.
Yes. Well, every 4 years for statewide, but yes,
Yeah,
every
so-
election cycle.
Again, I know in the last election cycle, it was in the middle of the cycle, the max contribution went from 290 to 320, I believe.
It would have gone from 250 to
Well, I had already
320,
jumped
right.
once. I
right.
think it was up to 290, but either way. But then, so that's one thing. That's not a major, like you can, so in the middle of the campaign, you just raise the amount that someone could donate. If someone donated the more than that initially, that still wouldn't be counted, right? Like if someone donated 300 and then it went up to 350, but they donated it before the change was official at 250, would that be
So the way the
a
law,
violation?
the way the law works, is that it's set at 250 for the election cycle until we do the adjustment
Okay.
for that election cycle. So for the House, that kind of makes sense, right? It's 250 non-participating and 250 for if you're in the CEP and raising before that election year. And then come January of the election year, we do the adjustment and it goes from 250 to 320. What we're proposing is that the adjustment would be made at the beginning of the 2-year cycle so that people have the choice of when they want to begin fundraising. And you would know that for the 2026, as soon as 2024 is over, you would know for 2026 what it's going to be. And it might be the same 320, or it might be that it's $5 less because you adjusted it a little bit earlier. But with the amounts that are that small of adjusting the 250, it's not much of a jump, the difference in a year. But if you wanted it, you could adjust it back a year to when you calculated it. So it's still the same amount of time. There's ways of handling it, but when you make that adjustment, we strongly recommend that it's at the beginning of the cycle, not in the middle of it.
I would tend to agree with that. Now that adjustment would apply to all the things we mentioned. So,
No,
because the hard part is when you change the amount that we have to raise, in the middle or something like that. So that,
it would apply to the two things that go to what you have to raise, your QC amount and your threshold amount.
okay.
It wouldn't apply to the amount of grant that you get or the amount of organization expenditures that can be spent on you. We would still make that at the later time with that additional percentage of increase because that doesn't happen until the election year. They're not, those limits aren't happening or being applied until the actual time of the giving of the grants.
See, personally, I don't think we should attach the consumer price index. We should just have a flat number and then we can come back and have a debate every 2 years to see whether there's more needed or not. I'm probably going to be one of the few candidates that think you guys give us more than enough money to run a state rep campaign. There's plenty, to get signs and, send out mailers and do all the different things you have to do. I do actually think there's plenty now. I don't think that number needs to grow. And then we have no control over the consumer price index. So it can get out of control sometimes, as it has with other issues as well. So
That would be much easier for us.
yes, and I would certainly support something that would get rid of it altogether, and we'd have more of a flat thing, and then we could come back and have this debate every 2 years. Oh, the cost of this went up and that went up, and we could have that debate. That's why we're here. So,
Well, we
but
do
it is what it is, and we'll deal with it until that time comes. But so going back to what groups are allowed to donate to a statewide campaign like we talked about, or the committees, the town committees and stuff? Who falls under that? The state committee, town committees?
The organization
Yes.
expenditures. So state central, town committees, legislative leadership, and legislative caucus committees are allowed to make organization expenditures.
Okay, and do we know what that max is now? I know it was 35, 42, is it, do you know what that number is?
I think it was close to 4,000
Yeah.
last time.
4,200, I think.
4,200.
For the first three types of committees, for town committees, legislative leadership and caucus committees, it's fixed, but for state central committees, I think it's unlimited.
Okay, because I kind of think if you participate in the program, you shouldn't need those monies as well, but that's again, another issue. And if someone violates that, what would, like, if someone, if a town committee or a state committee were to donate more to a campaign than the 4,200, what is the recourse? What, does someone have to make a complaint for you to look into that? That's not something you would generally audit yourself, is it?
Yes, that's true. We are required to have on our website a running list of the organization expenditures that have been reported, and you can sort that by both the committee making the organization expenditures and the candidate committee on whose behalf they've been made. And that's right on the front page of our website. You can go and look there at what's happening. So there's a lot of transparency around it. But it is reported by the committees making the expenditures, and we would look at that when a complaint was filed asking us to.
Okay. All right. Almost done. How do you determine which campaigns will be audited if it's 50%?
It is a random lottery, and it has been that way since 2011. So each committee is assigned a random number through a random number generator. And then we run those numbers and we select by district, counting how many candidates within each district until we get to 50% of the candidates. And then in, I think it was 2017, they changed that to be a weighted lottery. Because what they were finding was it wasn't an exact bell curve. You would expect it to be a bell curve if it's random, right? What they were finding was there were too many committees on the ends that their district was always getting audited or never getting audited. And they felt that was very unfair. So we went to a weighted lottery. So we look at the last 3 years. So every committee going into the lottery has at least one number or ticket in the raffle, right? You get one if you were on the ballot that year and raised or spent over $1,000. So everybody has some chance. But if then you get an extra ticket for each of the last 3 years that you were not selected. So if you've been selected for each of the last 3 cycles, in this 4th cycle, you only have 1 ticket. If you've never been selected in the last 3 cycles, then you have 4 tickets. And what we saw was the first time we ran that weighted lottery, immediately the curve straightened out and became very much a bell curve. There are, of course, I mean, mathematically speaking, you're going to have some on the bell curve over here and some over here. That's just how math works. But it definitely, most committees are selected about half the time now. And we have all of those statistics up on the front page of our website, and you can go and look by district and see the history of the district, not just for the last 3 or 4 years, but since we started doing the weighted lottery.
And so if does it get selected by district? So if my district comes up, 52nd district, anyone who ran and participated in the program in that district gets audited? So both, or if it's generally 2 candidates, right?
Yeah.
So do both candidates get audited?
Yes, everyone in that district who was on either a primary or general election ballot will then be part of the selection if they raised or spent over $1,000. So 1B filers are not included.
So again, and I'm thinking about now, and I appreciate that, and Representative Dathan had mentioned, maybe going to was it 20% or 25? And you said that you don't think that's a great idea, but we don't know who's going to get audited. So do you think, because, as long as there's the potential to get audited, I think that kind of does the thing. But because I know, like I said, treasurers, they do a lot of work, and I had a treasurer, we got audited, and it just takes forever, and it's constantly doing work way beyond you know what they thought they're going to be in, and they're not doing it. Certainly nothing shady going on in that stuff. We want to keep it simple and all that. We especially with things going on, we certainly want oversight, but we don't want to overdo it either. So I do think maybe, as long as there's uncertainty about who's going to get audited, I think that the purpose of it is going to be accomplished. So
I think if you look at it though, that we catch things in audit, and they're not always intentional, but we do find things. We've found this was intentional, that we found a treasurer who was in financial trouble floating herself loans in and out with the public money. We found expenditures made with cash when that's not allowed, so that it becomes untraceable as to who really received the public monies. We found personal use where people don't return the surplus and instead pay for the storage unit for their couch for a few years. We found a lot of things in the audit, and they've been corrected, and the treasurers have received training. And I do think that there's a value to that. The assumption would be that in the other 50% of the committees, things like that were also happening, but they weren't caught. One of the quickest ways to see the demise of a public financing program is scandals with how the money was spent. And in Connecticut, I think that we've had very strong oversight, and we've not had the kind of reports that are coming out based on aimed at other public financing programs and calling for their end because of scandals. And so I think that part of keeping Connecticut's program strong and protected and justifiable is the oversight, and being able to say, this is how the monies are spent, and they're spent correctly.
okay, one last thing, we should simplify. I know it's not a lot on the forms itself. I think the sole proprietor, I think that's a useless question.
We hated that.
It's a terrible
we opposed
question. It
that.
confuses. My son checked it off, like when he did it, and so we have to start. Like it's a little confusing. So there's a few other things as well. So I think that needs to be worked out. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Vale. Let me just follow up on some of the questions about the audits. And I very much appreciate being a scholar of ethics too. And I appreciate very committed to accountability and oversight and transparency. I appreciate the work you're doing, and the need for that independent judgment to make sure that everything is in fact running fairly and transparently. But I want to talk about the practicality of it as well. Just in terms of audits, there's a couple of things. One, a capacity problem. So when you say that the best way to have oversight to make sure that there's integrity in the elections is to do 100% auditing, that's going to come at some cost in terms of the capacity to be able to do that. And I would say are there other ways to be able to make sure we are able to make sure to ensure that integrity, like increasing the investigative powers? Because when we start trading off, when we have complaints that come in that can't be timely processed, that's another way to have more investigative powers and the ability to act quickly when a complaint comes in. That's actually a way, I would argue, a better way to ensure that the integrity of the system than the 100% audits, as long as there's some auditing happening as well to ensure, right, that people know that there's some risk. So whether that's 25% or 50%, as Representative Vale said, if there's some understanding that an audit is going to happen, there's some deterrence factor there. And it's not going to catch everything, which I would concede, but are there other ways that we can sort of ensure the integrity of the system, like the investigative powers? And what was happening, I saw, at least in the previous years, is a trade-off there. So one, what would it look like for you to even be able to do 100% auditing for every campaign? And where does that trade off in terms of other things that you'd be able to do to maintain oversight? I mean, how many people would that take?
So to be clear, we're not asking that the legislature return us from 50% to 100%. We're asking that they don't continue to diminish the oversight, which they began diminishing in 2011 when they took 40% of our staff. That's when they changed it to 50% of the audits. The other thing they did was they took a third of the time that we have to look at the audits because, and this would be a very simple change that you could make this election cycle that would make a fundamental difference. You could put the date to terminate the committees back to where it was when the program began. When the program began, candidate committees terminated on January 31st, which meant that we had February, March, April, May, and June to look at the audits. But the legislature, without speaking with us or any public hearing, changed that date for those selected for audit to July. They don't have to terminate until the beginning of July. So give us those months back. And honestly, the only thing that happens during those 5 months is people lose their documents and the basement floods, or they forget where they put them. So ending the election in November, paying your bills and collecting up your documents over the next 2 months or 3 months, actually 3 months, and giving them to us would allow us to use the 15 months that we have between when we're giving out grants to do the audits. That would be a tremendous improvement, and it's very simple.
And what was the rationale for changing that date? I
don't
wasn't
know.
here then, so I can ask these questions.
I imagine
Okay.
it went with a lot. It went with the loss of the agency's independence and a lot of other stuff that happened.
So are we talking about a staffing sort of a funding cut, which would support the agency more than the changing the number of the audits themselves? I mean, why would it be problematic to audit a representative sample? I guess that's what I'm wondering. Why does it need to be 100%?
It's 50%.
No, I understand, but your
So of
preference
the
would be
14 million that we gave out to the General Assembly, we will look at less than 7 million because there are non-participating candidates in that pool. So we will look at less than half. And the proposal is that there's two proposals. One is that we'll go down to looking at less than 3 million of the 14 million. And the other proposal is that if we don't get it all done in a year, and mind you, they don't even have to terminate until the July of the following year. Then they'll roll off and we won't be able to do them. So I have no idea how many that will leave undone and how many committees and how much public money that will result in not being looked at.
And then when it comes to the investigative powers, what is your position on that? I mean, what is the timeliness of the response for complaints that have come up during elections, special elections, primary elections, and your ability to respond to them in a way that would help, for example, curtail any issues that are happening in a timely fashion?
Most of our complaints are resolved within a year. And that's always been the case, but there was a 1-year provision put onto complaints that are filed with us, and very, very few roll off the agenda. What that does, though, is it takes away the ability of the executive director and general counsel to prioritize. And so when something like Bridgeport happens, where we are lending, our people are now going down and stationed in the police stations and working very closely with other enforcement officers, they're taken off, moving those 1-year complaints that might not be as important as Bridgeport, but are very important to the people that filed them. When the 1-year provision was passed, we told the legislature what it would take to be able to make that work. And the 1-year provision was passed and we were not given the extra people.
And to the extent that that you have the ability to kind of investigate these other complaints, that's been further limited then. Because the 1-year provision is not, given the sort of the nature of election cycles, that's not going to be timely in terms of resolving a complaint or an allegation that's about fraud in collecting contributions, for example, during that cycle. And so at what point do you send somebody to do, and that's what I mean about oversight, because the oversight a year later I'm not really sure how that helps when the election has already happened and there was a problem with that could have been remedied with more investigative powers during the election cycle, that then we a year later, we're like, oh, 3 years later, 3 years ago, this was a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to give you a little bit of comfort, allegations of fraud that come in a complaint about the fundraising that's under review before we give a grant out are considered within our grant application processes. And we have a methodology for speeding things up and looking at that before the grant is released. There's also something in the law that says you'll be required to give the entire grant back if it turns out that you fraudulently got it. So, that's an automatic $130,000 fine. People take it very seriously and work with us to resolve it. I think when committees have been confronted with something in a complaint that indicated that something went very wrong, they've withdrawn their applications. So I think that it's not that that's ignored and goes ahead. There are things in the law with respect to that. As I said, when the 1-year provision came in, we had a fiscal note, I believe it was for 4 positions. Giving us those 4 positions since the 1-year provision was passed, or adjusting the 1-year provision to make more sense in how it's implemented or repealing it would be extremely helpful in allowing for the prioritization of things. Those are all options. As far as they go with as that juxtapositions with the discussion about whether we do post-election reviews, though, that's a different matter. One of the things we found when you go from 100%, everybody knows that everybody's going to be looked at and they don't have to worry about it. When you go to 50%, you start seeing a lot more complaints. Those complaints aren't about the things that are really important and wrong. They're random things for the people who have that kind of approach to politics. And so those are much more likely to be dismissals. Whereas if something is elevated to enforcement for a further investigation or a penalty out of the post-election review process, it's a serious problem. And there's a reason for it. So what you have, and that's why New York City's campaign finance program, which is one of the longest running in the nation, has the 100% audits, because they firmly believe that what that means is by the time you get to enforcement, it's the people that should be enforced against, not the ones who have opponents who want to file complaints. And so, and that's what we find. And also, just to understand, we don't do 100% audits. We also don't do 100% of everything. When we audit a campaign, we have a stratified audit. So we only look at certain things. We only look at amounts over a certain level. The first year that we ran the audits, we were learning what was out there so that we could better design the process. But we don't look at the Dunkin' Donut receipt, and we haven't since 2008. It's a very streamlined process for what we look at. We don't look at the contributions again if you've come in the grant application. And we certainly don't subject the non-participating contributions to the same level of what we look at for the contributions when we're releasing tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars based on those.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And so what sort of is your ideal staffing level that you would say, that you would suggest it would take to be able for you to feel comfortable saying this has been fairly certified?
You might know that we do not have at this moment an executive director and general counsel. Um, that's the kind of executive decision that that person would make. I mean, you're asking, you know, we would like 1 million people. Uh, We could do everything we wanted to do. Obviously, there's limited resources and we have to make decisions and triage things. And that's going to be the case whether we have, 10 more people or 10 less people. I know that our executive director was trying to get more investigators. That was one of his last asks was more investigators. I think our head of audit has his own ideas about what we need and what we don't need. I think he's
I think it's about 4 positions that were included with the fiscal note. And that was well thought out at the time that the 1-year provision passed, and it has passed. Moving the audits, I believe there's a thought that that would take an associate accounts examiner position that would allow things to keep moving and not have to come to a grinding halt when we start the application process. Obviously, that's something our new executive director and general counsel will be looking at as soon as they get here and may have a fuller thing. My first reaction to you is a very emotional plea. Please, please, please allow us the 35 we have. That's actually not going forward right now. We put in a budget, we have budgetary protections to be allowed to fund our 35 positions. But in the back of the governor's workbooks, there's a $300,000 reduction to our staffing. We don't know what positions those are. We don't understand how that would work. Assuming that we would go into deficit, not lay anybody off. At a minimum, though, when somebody retires or leaves the agency, we're required to say, do you have the monies to pay for these people before we can put in for a replacement? And if this went through, we'd have to say no. And we don't even know who it would be that would leave, which critical person we wouldn't be allowed to replace for that 300,000. So that is essential to the operation of the agency, being fully funded for the positions that we do have.
I appreciate that. And with sort of limited resources, where would you say your priorities are? Would it be with the investigative?
So in 2011, our missions remained completely the same, and we lost 40% of our staff. And Josh and I have both been here with the program since we started it, when we were 53 people. And our jobs have become, since 2011, 2012, constantly prioritizing what needs to be done when and how can we do more with technology faster. We're very, very, very excited to have been able to bring back on an IT director who understands our processes. We're looking at updating the kinds of reports we run so that we can automate a lot of processes. He has actually had experience with campaigns outside of the agency and has a lot of ideas for ways that we're going to be able to automate things for treasurers so that they can run the reports that we run through eCRIS, and they'll be able to see what we're going to catch when we run our reports and fix those things ahead of time. And they'll be able to do it real time when they choose to upload, for example, their credit card information, be able to hit a button through eCRIS and it will do a search. And they'll be able to see the kinds of things that are going to cause us to ask for fixes, and they'll know the fixes and can send them out right away. So we have a whole lot going on within the agency to try to make things easier. Being able to upload your documents through eCRIS instead of having to drive them up or put them on, scan them in and possibly miss documents when you're scanning. We want to be able to do an upload into eCRIS. We have all of these technological changes that we're looking at to try to make it easier. Lots of dreams.
Thank you.
We just need time and people.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it, Representative Dathan, and I have a couple of questions about, but I'll turn it over to Representative Dathan. I know Representative Carney had questions as well.
I still have a number of questions, and I know I've asked a few, and Rep. Carney has been waiting so patiently. So I'm going to defer to him, and then I'll come back for my second round.
Great. Representative Carney?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I apologize. I'm been on and off for that's why we're a part-time legislature. So thank you for your testimony. I do have a couple of I guess general questions regarding some of this legislation. I apologize if it's redundant. If it is, just tell me. I guess regarding the third party legislation for things like WinRed and Act Blue, I guess if that legislation were to pass, how would someone be within SEC guidelines in terms of soliciting contributions? I mean, would there be any sort of because right now, if you know, a third party solicits contributions to you on Facebook, I believe it has to be documented or it's a violation. So, do you know what those steps would be, or if this is even feasible?
Well, just stepping back, our North Star is that with the public financing program, candidates who are trying to get public funds need to do their own fundraising. Now, there's different levels of deviation from that, but the one that involves Act Blue or WinRed or whatever other platform is out there, the problem is that they're businesses that are doing the fundraising. And it's not just a third party, it's a business doing fundraising. And long before the CEP, long before we were all here, businesses have been always prohibited from making contributions, like making in-kind contributions for any committee. Businesses are just not allowed to do it. You can have a business PAC do it or a union PAC do it, but this is a business, national corporation using their vast resources, to help fundraise for publicly financed candidates. And so that's what this bill would do. There's lesser problems with it. We actually have spoken with Act Blue and people in the legislature about like how it could be done in a way that doesn't damage the program. And there are ways that businesses with models like that can operate in Connecticut. They just can't do all the things they do outside of Connecticut. And then mostly that's very doable for these entities because they can switch functionality on and off. But for example, they can solicit tips for themselves. They can't currently do that, but there's a legislative fix proposed that would allow them to do that and allow them to operate in Connecticut. But the deviation that's being requested is to allow businesses to make in-kind contributions to candidates in Connecticut, and that's a big change from campaign finance law, not just CEP law. It's a big change.
Okay. No, I appreciate that because that's kind of what I was thinking. I personally do not like the legislation, and I think that it really does weaken the point of the program, which is raising your own money and being a viable candidate. Having somebody else do it for you is not acceptable in my opinion. So I guess this is more of a general question, and I know I had spoken to SEC about this a while ago, and I almost was going to propose legislation for it, but I didn't because I was told it could be done or it's required already. But that is with really political action committees or town committees that raise money during election season, particularly for state elections, and spend money on a particular candidate, making that more transparent. Because currently, at least how I see it, and I know it's not supposed to be this way, the only people I see actually being transparent about contributions to benefit a candidate are actually the House and Senate Democrat and Republican political action committees. So I would like to see something that really pushes other committees to make this information transparent so that a candidate, because I mean, personally, right now, I think the limits are ridiculous. I don't think a town committee should be able to spend, I don't know, $4,500 on a candidate. Again, I think that defeats the purpose of the program. But is there any way that within your system you can require a town committee to indicate what they're spending, who it's on? Because I'll give you an example, a real life example. You know, in my election, the person running against me, all I see is who the payment's going to. No reason for it. No, the candidate's not named. So there's no way for me to even know if they're violating the rules or not. And there's no way for you to know if they're violating the rules or not. So is there anything that can be done regarding that?
Yes, and I think you'd be pleasantly surprised with the answer. It's already being done. The town committees that spend money on organization expenditures do these things up to $4,500, like you were speaking of. They do have to report them, and also they have to report who it benefits. So their form and our advice to them is to report what they're spending and who they're spending it on, and that information is displayed on our website. The limitation on it is that, they have to do it only quarterly. They make their reports on a schedule, but that information is or should be included in the Form 20s of every town committee, every party committee, the legislative leadership committees too. Every dollar that they spend to benefit a candidate and what it was spent on. And we know that a lot of people do it, and we have good communication with the legislative leadership and caucus committees to help them do it, because they do a lot of spending on that, and they ask for our help and how to report it correctly, and they're very good about it. Probably the case is that town committees might be a little less rigorous about it, and they call us less about it, but they are required to do it.
Okay. No, I mean, it's, and I know that from SEC, but it just seems like I pulled up that page right now, and very rarely do I see a town committee listed. I see House Republicans and House Democrats. I mean, they're following the letter of the law, but very rarely do I see an actual town committee posting that. And it's not that they're not spending money, because they are spending money. They're just not reporting it. And like I said, I mean, is there any way to force them to do it? If they put down that they make an expenditure, have something that says, did this benefit a candidate? And it might be on there, but they're just not doing it.
Well, we're by trade compliance attorneys, so our first our first resort is to try to convince them to do it, which is really, your suggestions are really helpful. But my response would be, we should probably engage in some outreach with the town committees to make sure that they're aware of the responsibility and how to fill out these forms correctly, and that they're under an obligation to fill out these forms correctly. And we can even design trainings to help them do that.
Okay. No, and I appreciate that, because it is something that I thought about proposing legislation on, but was told it was, already required. It's just, just what I've seen on there. I guess the only other question, and it may have been asked regarding audits, is, I guess, what is your thought regarding, any sort of a statute of limitations on audits? And the reason I ask that is because one of my colleagues proposed this, because there's still an audit going on regarding a campaign from 6 years ago. So at what point does SEC say, okay, we're not going to do it? It's over. We're not going to keep, this docket open. I mean, is there any sort of a time limit you think should be implemented?
I think the answer to that largely is a one-year provision was adopted in Look at Bridgeport. And be sure that statute of limitations and roll-offs aren't preventing oversight. Again, this is the quickest way to see a public financing program go away is through scandal. But also, before you do that, please change the date of termination, put it back where it was when the program began, and give us the extra 5 months. Let us get an executive director and general counsel in and catch up, and correct the damage that was done to the statute in 2012 and see how that works.
Okay.
It'd be the first step.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. I wasn't here in 2012, so so I didn't know that happened. But overall, I appreciate all you do. Like I said, I mean, if it were up to me, I would probably either make it all SEs or all CEP or no CEP. I have a lot of concerns about this gray area, and you might too, about extra fundraising that's going on that really, I got to tell you, I mean, I don't know what my grant was, $37,000. I thought that was too high, but some of my colleagues may disagree. And then that's out of your control. Some of my colleagues may disagree, but I do think that with all that extra spending from third parties, it really does negatively affect the reason for the program. But again, I do appreciate all you do and your testimony. So thanks.
Thank you, Representative Carney. Representative Dathan?
Thank you so much for letting me jump in again. So I just want to understand a little bit about the selection process for the candidates. I know you kind of addressed it initially and talked about how it was done very randomly, but it does seem like we have, I've talked to many colleagues who have gone through, 7 or 8 audits in the last sort of almost every election that they've done in the last sort of that same time period. In terms of the weighted amount, it sounds like to me that at each cycle you say, okay, this is how much the grants funded. We need to get X% coverage over the audits. Is that how the sort of population is done, or is it straight 50% of all candidates running? So let's say that, we have several candidates who have returned money. It sounds like Rep. Carney may have returned money because his grant was so big. And I'm making a joke. But in terms of, folks, and we kind of look at the net outflows of the grants to determine the coverage. How is that kind of taken into account? Because I'm trying to still understand this sort of randomness of the 50%.
The randomness is by district. We choose by district. And the reason we do that is because when we studied other public financing programs, one of the feedbacks from them was that they had seen some real injustices. They felt when they weren't doing it by office or district because somebody in a district would be subject to a review and have a review done and mistakes would be found. And the person who wasn't subject to a review would then be saying, oh, look, they weren't honest, they didn't do these things. So if everybody in the district is looked at, it's more fair. If you're looked at, your opponent is looked at. So we do it by districts and we select by districts. I have had some discussions with people who feel they've been chosen every time, but it's because they were a treasurer for one candidate in one district and then they ran as a candidate in another district. In a different year, that district was selected and now they're running for Senate. And that district, if you're hopping around and perceiving yourself as being selected when you're a treasurer and selected when you're a candidate, or if you're a treasurer for multiple districts and you're thinking, well, I was selected every year, but you were a treasurer for 5, that increases your chances to be selected too. It's not personal. It's by district, and each committee is looked at.
And additionally, it's by office. So state reps and state senators get 50% of all the districts. Statewide officers are 100% audited. Also, I saw something in the law that would require that in this one of the proposals that would require our lotteries to be public and to be notified. They are already, and we have people from ethics come and observe them. Everybody is welcome to come and observe them. We also film them and put those films up on our website so you can actually watch it. It's not a something that's done in a back room at all. It's really purely a mathematical random number generator that's selecting these things. It's not, we don't know who's in these districts. We don't care. We're just trying to get our numbers in, our quota.
Yeah.
Audits done. It's not personal.
Okay. In terms of like software you use for auditing purposes, is it internally developed or are you using some sort of off-the-shelf audit software? Because I'm trying to think of where there might be ways that we can help facilitate the timeliness of these audits. If we make it, you kind of think of like a QuickBooks system where individuals can like take a picture of a receipt, post it to the transaction. And then if they're audited, they can kind of share that information with you. And then it goes into your automated system to facilitate the audit process. Is there any system that you all use that might even have some AI elements that would facilitate the audit process?
You sound like you've been talking with our new IT director. He's talking about all of those types of things with our director of disclosure and all the different ways that we can do that. The help that we could get would be to be allowed to fill the IT position that we're currently trying to fill. We're waiting for those approvals to go through, one of our 35 positions, and keeping us able to fund that. We need the IT people in order to be able to streamline. But yes, taking a picture with your phone and posting it up along with the expenditure itself, through the electronic system that candidates all use is exactly the kind of thing that he is talking about and focusing on.
I mean, there are products that do that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be internally developed because that could be a long, cumbersome, expensive process. And so I do think, with my background, I know that there are lots of different softwares in place that could help facilitate your audit process and utilize some of the AI features. So I'll stay tuned to that, hopefully get some good understanding. Is there any sort of report that you do, or how do you notify the public on what percentages of irregularities are found, what percentages of audit problems are found, and what percentage of sort of like what might be intentional fraud? How do you communicate that to the public?
Unfortunately, probably not enough. One of the problems with our staffing level is that we don't have people to look at the meta information about what we even do. We do what we do when we try to get it done, but we rarely have time to pause and look back and assess it and do the reports that would make what we do and are proud of doing known to people outside our immediate vicinity. So, I mean, that's probably another place where technology could help because we do produce reports, audit reports, final audit reports for all these committees. And maybe there's some way that like AI could look at all those things and maybe synopsize the findings. But we don't have people, we don't have a PR department. We don't have a real communications department. You're more or less looking at it. So it would be wonderful, but it's something that we don't have the capacity to do right now.
Yeah, I know, I use your website and I think you do a really good job communicating and posting all of your sort of meetings and the agendas and everything. And I commend you on that with a skinny team. Maybe kind of taking a broader picture then, since the program was founded, how many, and maybe it's just a percentage, how many cases of substantial fraud has the oversight and audit process uncovered?
I don't have those statistics right now. I know at one point when we looked at it, we found that about 5 or 6% of the committees that we looked at were being referred to enforcement for further investigation and civil penalties. Anecdotally speaking, it's the kinds of things that I mentioned, the public funds being floated in and out of the committee to finance bills that the treasurer was paying, personal use, failure to return a couple $1,000s worth of surplus, things like that. So there are findings. The thing to understand about our audit also, though, is that its function isn't only in finding wrongdoing and giving people a fine. Much more important than that for us is understanding what's happening and how we can do our jobs better, where people need more training and assistance and outreach, where treasurers need more support. That's something that comes out of these reviews. And changes every 2 years. We improve what we do based on what we learn. The other thing that comes out of it is training for the treasurers, right? So if you make a mistake that's over a certain amount of money, you get a finding and you get it written up and you get a chance to look at it and understand that next time you can do this better. Some types of findings we found are so common that what we do is when they get it, it's not that we refer them, it's that we call them and we go through, hey, this is why you have a right to have this documentation. This is why you should keep it. This is how it works. Here's some samples of things that you might be looking for. And we do a lot of support of the treasurer so that they understand. So it's much more of a broader benefit than just we caught somebody doing something wrong and we find them. It's a lot more cooperative, I think.
Okay, I mean, that is useful. Kind of going back to the fire districts and things like that. What in terms of sort of special outside districts that might be counted? I've got some numbers around about 320 different sort of special taxing districts statewide, and it appears like a small number, around 40 or 50, would be part of that. In terms of, an opportunity to kind of support those elections, because those are really important, and everyone knows that, what happens locally is probably some of the most impactful things on your day-to-day life. And so, for me, that's something that I think would be helpful for SEEK to be part of that. We'll have some additional testimony on that coming up. But I do think, I'd like to understand a little bit more within the 1406 bill. We have some discussion around the sort of online platform and how that works. I understand that this language was acceptable in 2023 or 2024. And now you're saying that you oppose it. Could you please elaborate why is there a change in wording that has changed your mind here, or what the situation might be?
Are you talking about the Act Blue type of language?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, there's two aspects to it. And you're right. Last legislative session or over the summer, we had discussions that on language that was acceptable, that wouldn't damage the program, to allow companies like Act Blue to operate in Connecticut. Particularly their business model, that was the hang up, was that they have a feature that when you give a contribution, you're asked to also give to the platform, to ActBlue in this case, a tip jar, it's called. Now that was problematic for different reasons. You know, is the candidate giving something to the business, or is the business giving something to the candidate? Is it a contribution to the candidate to allow this to happen, or is it a contribution from the business to the candidate? It's the kind of thing that sets our hair on fire. It's like when businesses and candidate committees start being too intertwined, that you get these situations where the business could unintentionally be making an in-kind contribution to the candidate committee. Now, in this case, it's not a big deal, but it's still a problem that had to be addressed. So the way that we addressed the problem, the language that we found that was acceptable, was to take that little type of interaction out of the definition of contribution and out of the definition of expenditure. So it's neither an expenditure nor a contribution between the committee and the business, because it's just soliciting money for their business model. Now, that was fine. This bill goes beyond that. It says that not only can they ask for tips, they can actually start soliciting for other candidates and making recommendations for other candidates to give to, and using their algorithms to say, oh, you like, you know, Representative Dathan. Well, here's 10 more people that you might like and that are in the CEP and that need your funding too. And that's a lot of help. That's a lot of help from the corporation to do fundraising for CEP candidates. It's a lot more than a little tip jar. So that was our issue with this legislation.
Okay.
Section.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Section 2 and 3 of 1406 were what were acceptable, and section 1 was never acceptable and continues to cause problems.
Okay, I misunderstood. I thought you had accepted it. But it's you know, it's something I think we need to have additional discussions on. I know a few other people have done testimony on that, so we'll continue to look at. You know, in terms of the sort of changes in documentation that are needed for expenses, I know one issue I've heard from like my campaign consultant firm, where they have a contract in place that is a monthly retainer, and it's a flat rate. Let's say it's, you know, $1,200 for 6 months, and each $200 increment is billed at a period. If we have a contract in place for a fixed dollar amount, why is there additional support needed for what that happened in the said period of a fixed price contract?
So when the public financing program came into existence, also came into existence Regulation 9-607-1. And that has 2 requirements for documentation. The first is that when services are provided, because, you know, it's not like going to Walmart where you can look up what a printer costs and Google it across the board. Services are just a different animal, and it's hard to know what you're going to be charged for them. So treasurers are to get in writing a statement of what's going to be done, how much of it's going to be done, and how much they're going to be charged ahead of time. And the reason for that is because their job is to ensure that the public funds are being spent for a proper purpose. So if you just say, I'm going to pay you $90,000 to do my communications, you have no idea whether that is a normal, unusual charge. And it's going to become very difficult to stay within your expenditure limit. So when they put the program into place, they put tools that allowed the treasurers to do their oversight job into place at the same time. What are you going to do? How much of it are you going to do? And what are you going to charge for it? And then on the back end, there is the invoicing saying, this is what I did, please pay me. So we will see documentation And we did a review of some documentation that we were receiving, and we had questions like you did, what's happening here? And so we looked at all the documentation of somebody who used a certain consultant, and what we found was the documents were exactly the same. They said, I'm doing the same thing, but one committee was charged $10,000 a month, and another committee was charged $1,000 a month, and there was no clear record of why. And so we thought, well, maybe it's just documentation. We interviewed the treasurers, we interviewed the campaign managers, we interviewed the candidates, and nobody could tell us what had been done for sure, what the difference was. They didn't understand what was happening, and it wasn't documented. So I think that the requirements that were put into place with the program make sense. I think that if treasurers can get the documentation that they need, they'll be able to perform their duties and be a lot happier. And that's why our proposal is to allow us to, instead of going through the treasurers who are very frustrated, I hired an experienced consultant and they won't give me that documentation. This will allow us, if a consultant is receiving a certain amount of the grant monies, to ask the consultant themselves directly and take the treasurer out of that frustrating position.
I guess my confusion is you have a contract up front that lists out the services that are going to be performed within a certain time period. And, it's not like going to buy a printer, because a printer is a fixed good that you can say this is, a good rather than a service. Well, the services, you have maybe a term on these with all these sort of aspects of what's going to happen during that term. And then you have an agreed upon schedule for amounts, services, and time. And it's a sort of fixed amount a month. And so then having a separate invoice that just says, hey, this is, according to the contract dated X and agreed upon, this is the, May contracted amount. And I think having that additional sort of, questions in there might not be quite needed, because it's all outlined in the contract and what's going to be done. And understandably, if you have a Senate race versus a state rep race, the amount of services that need to be done in any given contract period would be different, and therefore a fixed monthly retainer for those services would be different because it's the level of services needed. So I'm just sort of trying to understand why there might be the need for additional documentation when you have a fixed rate contract that's executed between the service provider and the treasurer. The treasurer can upload that contract as part of the sort of retainer payment. But why we need to have, additional sort of breakout of hours and things like that, I'm not sure how much extra value that provides. And again, I'm coming at it with my sort of auditing eyes. I did public accounting for several years before, and I'm a CPA before I went into, corporate finance and then CFO of companies. And it's usually in those sort of companies, SEC regulated companies and other companies, if you have a contract for services, it doesn't seem that you need to have, necessarily a timesheet, because you're not billing upon, a fee for service. It's a fixed rate contract. So maybe in May, the number of hours might be less than the number of hours that the consultant might put in October, but yet the payment is amortized over the 6-month period. So I guess I'm just trying to understand why we need that sort of duplicate documentation in place. Because again, I have heard from so many treasurers who just say, I don't want to do this anymore because, the level of documentation and the things that, I have to keep going back and forth on things like this, are cumbersome. So just wanted to kind of get an understanding of that. And it sounds like you're just saying that you need to do both, duplicate efforts, even though you have a fixed place contract.
So when we looked into, I mean, we're releasing $14 million of public money. And there's a fundamental difference between $1,000 for a single phone call in a month and $1,000 for organizing 3 mail drops and a weekly meeting and setting plans. It's a matter of just simply keeping contemporaneous documentation as you go and saying, this is what I did. I come from a law firm where we build in 15-minute increments. I know it's onerous and we don't require that, but we do require a statement of what you did so that we can evaluate whether the services were a usual and normal charge. And, you know, bringing it back to one scandal we had, there was somebody whose payment it turned out to be $500 an hour for licking envelopes. When we asked, what were you doing? Show us the documentation. That's what we found they were being paid for. And treasurers need to have the visibility as they pay it out, how much we look at it, and the amount of attention that it gets obviously depends on the amount of money that's going out. If it's $10,000 a month, we'd certainly expect there to be some documentation of what you did beyond a general statement of, I'm going to do campaign stuff for you during your campaign, and list a bunch of campaign things and then have no documentation of whether any of that was done. Contemporaneous documentation is required for the spending of public money.
I just want to jump in to ask, what would the consequence of that be when you make an assessment that a service, you know, that the sort of the payment for the service went well beyond what sort of a general or reasonable fee would be? What then?
So that's like part of the 4 to 5% of the post-election reviews that would be referred on for further investigation and penalties.
And what is so a consequence could potentially be penalties for, and that would be based on a hearing as to whether or not that was appropriate.
Did I miss anything?
A lot of this, I mean, we've been, I don't get involved in the audit process too much, but I am asked to look at some things, and a lot of times common sense is our guiding star here. You would be shocked at the minimal level of documentation that some of these huge expenditures have, you know, $15,000 media services. That's all it says. I mean, literally, that's true. It's like some people do a great job, and the media services are all listed out, views per person, eyeballs seeing, you know, the dates that they were done. That's acceptable. You know, it's when it gets to be this, it's kind of like they're telling us to go pound sand with these documentations. You know, it's like it would be unacceptable to anybody in this room.
No, and I understand, of course. I guess for me, I'm just trying to distinguish between a lack of proper documentation for services that were actually rendered, and then an overcharging, or in whose estimation there was an overcharge, and whether or not there's a penalty then based on everything was documented, but we don't think the fees were appropriate. And are there cases where there are significant penalties because there's a disagreement as to the contractually agreed payment for a service, rather than the service was just never documented. We have no idea what somebody did and they're charging $15,000. Because to me, those are two different things. Both may be problematic, but then the question of who uses the judgment in the category where it's not, you know, when there was already been an understanding as to the payment, or who's, you know, what the cost for the service was, but there's a disagreement as to whether it's appropriate. That's different than a lack of documentation. So in how many instances did we have sort of a disagreement about, you know, whether or not the fee was appropriate versus there's no documentation for something like media services. Can you provide us further information?
That's when we did that first review of the 2014 or 16 and we looked, that's what we were trying to figure out. Like maybe the documentation isn't needed. When you talk to the people, you'll be able to tell. And what we found was that the treasurers and the candidates and the campaign managers couldn't tell you. They couldn't go back through their calendars. They couldn't go back through their emails and their phone records and say, oh, yeah, this month it was $10,000 and this is what I received for $10,000. They couldn't do that. They needed the contemporaneous documentation from the consultant that was doing the work. Just a list on the invoice, and they would have been able to say, yeah, we had a meeting every week. We had these discussions. There was this follow-up, and they arranged this mail drop with this many volunteers. And there would be no problem. But instead, we came away saying, we don't know what happened. We also found that the documentation failures caused campaigns to not recognize that this mailer was actually for another campaign. So one campaign paid for another one's mailer. We found excess expenditures and we found what looked like discounts. So the last mailer would be charged at 30% less of a rate than the first mailer. Major violations hidden in failures to document, and a huge amount of resources went into trying to figure out exactly your question. And what we found was the documentation really, really matters. We're very sensitive to the fact that the treasurers, some of them are volunteers, some of them are new to this. We don't want to chill anything. So what we've been asking the legislature to do is please put the liability where it belongs with the people who should be creating this documentation so that the treasurers can do their job.
And you think pushing back that date would be helpful in this process because people are likely to have more contemporaneous details rather than 5 months later, like with an end date of July.
The date would help, but it's part of our proposal in 7089 that if the documentation isn't given to the treasurers, then instead of trying to go back to the treasurers and say, can you go see if they can give this to you? Can you look through your emails and see if you can figure out what they did for this? We can go to the consultants and say, please produce an invoice that explains what you did. And it will be the consultants who failed to do that will be on the line, and not the treasurers who ask and ask and ask for the documentation and don't receive it.
I want to
That's very
add that
helpful.
what Shannon was talking about, that the provision that we're asking for would put liability on consultants, but only the consultants who are doing business with publicly funded financed candidates. So they're taking the money from the public to spend it. So there's an increased obligation on them.
Absolutely.
And
No,
only
thank you.
when
That
they're
helps. That
receiving a
clarifies.
certain amount of the funds as well.
I'm sorry.
And only when they're receiving a certain amount of the funds.
A large amount.
Yeah.
Great. No, thank you. And sorry, Representative Dathan, I just want to clarify that. Thank you. That
No,
was
no, yeah, no, I have to sign off in a second. I wanted to also just make sure that I fully understand, you know, having that, I understand what sort of the end goal is, but if you kind of have a contract for a fixed amount, you list out what it is, surely, the way the nature of campaigns work, the work is sort of back-ended. So, you're not doing mailers in May, you're doing them in September and October. So that's kind of where I think the difficulty rides. And then you can say maybe, rate per hour for the amount of work that you do in May is a certain number that seems a little bit high. But then when you look at the rate per hour that's done in October, you're thinking, the person's making very sub minimum wage. And so that was what I was trying to understand, because you've listed out, and the candidate and the treasurer are overall responsible for the delivery of services that are outlined in those, and they do have that oversight if the contractor's doing the work. I have to sign off, but I might come back later with some additional questions in a bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Dathan. I just, and I know we have other questions from Representative Vail. I just wanted to follow up on your objection on 1406. So your objection is to section 1, but presumably section 1B. But section 1C, I wanted to see if there was any objection to that, because That's the online platform that collects a contribution from the contributor, and it's just basically prohibiting automatic recurring contributions. So is that something you're objecting to as well?
So,
Fourteen oh
of Bill
six,
1406, Section 1
section 1,
is a change to
Subsection B.
9-601A subsection B. That's problematic.
subsection B is probably, yeah, I'm asking
Yeah.
about subsection C. Yeah, so
And
you
then
said,
the next thing in that bill at line 21 is Section 2.
Yeah, let's just talk about the second
Section
paragraph of,
C.
um,
subsection C.
this paragraph C. I don't think the recurring contribution language is something that we're terrified about.
Right, I presume that's a good thing. Okay, I just wanted to make sure your objection is for subsection B. That's the, okay, thank you. That's what I just wanted to clarify that. Because you said, and then you said you support sections 2 and 3, but also the rest of it, or are there other portions of that that you have an objection to? I'd just be curious to know what they are.
The 2 and 3 are
Jar.
the tip jar language.
Yeah,
That's
which
fine.
is appropriate. Okay. So it's really just section 1, subsection B, which, okay. Okay, and I appreciate that objection.
And then after that is the additional people for us. No objection to
All
that.
the districts,
But the districts are frightening.
yes, the tax districts are, yeah, they're a big, big question mark. We don't understand what it means.
And as you talk to us about reducing oversight of the public funds, at the same time, we talk about possibly increasing our jurisdiction by quite a bit when the state's been all right without that happening. Those two things viewed together, I think, are enlightening.
No, understandable. Yeah, thank you. Representative Hill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple follow-ups based on some things. What if we change the end date of campaigns to January 31st? Then would that 1-year limitation be more feasible?
I don't know. I don't recommend a 1-year limitation. Let us try this and see if we can make that work. The 1-year limitation operates within our enforcement as an unknown and subjects us to truly problematic prioritizations and rock and a hard place choices that I don't think anybody's actually really very happy with. And I wouldn't suggest it being done any further, and certainly not within the public financing program.
Trying to throw you a bone here on the January 31st.
Well,
thing.
please do that. I think.
Well, you can't have it both ways, so. All right, and so you mentioned currently, that you have no director and no counsel.
Our executive director and general counsel retired for medical reasons.
Okay,
Yes,
those are two different people.
that's one
All right,
person.
so it's general director and counsel. That's one position. And that person,
We have
Who-
an
who-
interim director, and we are seeking to replace with a permanent executive director.
Yeah, we have an interim.
who
director that
who
was
makes
started.
that hire,
Our commission.
which is,
So our commission is, it's a 5-person bipartisan commission. The 5 appointees are 2 by the House and 2 by the Senate, 1 from each party,
Mhm.
and the governor appoints the 5th. And they amongst themselves elect a chair, but the commission votes to hire and fire the executive director and general counsel. And in this case, yesterday, Wednesday, they hired, as of March 21st, an interim executive director and general counsel to operate until the permanent one is found.
is that the top of the line for you guys?
Yeah, that would be our boss.
And who would he report to?
She or
Or
he,
she, sorry, my bad.
would report to the commission, the chair of the commission.
And the commission reports to no one.
Correct. Well, I guess they're appointing
Mhm.
personnel, so,
And who appoints them? And you said, you already told me that. All right, so I
Speaker
get
of the
that part.
House, the ranking
Yep.
member of the House,
Mhm.
Senator,
Yep.
President of the Senate, and ranking member of the Senate, and then the
Okay.
governor gets to appoint.
Okay. Are you, I don't know, are you a public agency or quasi-public?
We're a public agency, but under the executive branch, but with special carve outs as a watchdog like ethics and FOI for special treatment.
Okay, and then, okay, good enough. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have just a couple of questions. Again, this is back to the sort of practical issues that came up in campaigns last year. Uh, in terms of how you prioritize certifying campaigns as contributions are coming in, when you have a special election or a primary election, when there's a fixed timeline, what was happening, particularly last year, was that I guess I mean, I'm presuming you're taking applications and processing them as they come in. How does that impact special elections or, elections where there's a very limited, timeline, and that processing then is delayed because of the backlog of all the elections? And I'm talking about, my own primary over the summer I mean, it was unusual because you had a large number of candidates, but the amount of time it took to process the campaign contributions. And also, I appreciate your comment about this being the agency having a role of helping treasurers, but we didn't get any responses back for like weeks. We were actually on our way up to sit in. My treasurer was ready to go up to the office to sit in front of someone to say, I need a response on why these contributions are being kicked back, because we were ready to rectify it, which we had to do several times, but without any direction or without any guidance as to why there was a problem, why it was getting kicked back for weeks. And then it also took a month for basically the entire thing to be processed, with the 2 months basically to go in a primary. Now, I mean, I'm giving you anecdotally, but what I can say is I've heard that was the case throughout for other campaigns as well. That those campaigns didn't feel the impact of it because it wasn't a limited time frame. So when there's a special election and when there's a limited time frame, is there some way to process those applications first, like bring them to the head of the line because of that limited time frame? It didn't seem like that was happening last year. So I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that. And if you can let me know how that worked, because there wasn't a lot of information coming back to the campaigns as to why the number of contributions that were rejected increased so significantly from previous years, without a lot of feedback on why that was happening.
Um, uh, So with respect to the primaries, we have a blackout period where we don't look at anything else that's statutory. But in addition to that, as we lead up to the primaries, we are definitely watching and prioritizing those campaigns that we know have primaries to get them the information. A lot of what happens with a campaign is within the control of the campaign. And how quickly they get us back the fixes, whether they sit on them, whether they want to discuss whether they should have to fix this or not, or whether they go out and get the replacement or fixes right away. Those are things that we can't really help. I know that the elections officers will get the results of looking, and within hours, they have that email out to the treasurer. If they have so many indications of feedback coming in at once for their committees, they work together to pass it off. Sometimes we call and give it verbally if we can't get it to them in writing quick enough so that they can at least start working on things that we know. So we have a lot of processes in place to try to help with that. What happened with the primaries this year is something that's never happened before. A lot of them waited till the last minute. It was just phenomenal, the shift in how people behaved as far as coming in for the grant. It used to be the folks who knew that they had primaries were in early. But this time we had a lot of committees for the very first time ever coming in on the day of, and that created a backlog for everybody. So, I don't know what more we can do as far as explaining to people that, you know, there's a lot of people in line and you need to come in early. In the end, it's the choice of the treasurers, how quickly they respond and how
Well,
they
but
respond.
but for special, I mean, for special elections, you can't come in early because you, in a way, don't even know that you have to start raising that money, unlike other campaigns that know that election's coming up. And that was really, that was an issue. But I can tell you anecdotally, the issue for our campaign was a lack of communication. There was definitely communication on the part of the treasurer. There was no feedback as to, you know, why the contributions were rejected, with several sort of, there's no ability to rectify unless there's an explanation as to why these are being rejected. And my understanding from numerous campaigns is that was, and now I understand if there's a staffing problem, which is why I ask about the capacity question, which is important because because the capacity is going to impact your overall functioning in all areas. But this was certainly, it was, I mean, it was not disastrous, but it was certainly a problem in a very limited time frame. And for me, for example, we were the first campaign in and were not certified despite several rounds of rectifying and waiting for these answers until everyone else was there. And then with a week to go, that was also not great because people were getting, you know, just unlimited mailers coming from every single candidate with 1 week to go in the campaign. And then there was questions about, is that an appropriate way to spend money just in the last week? Because that's when all the campaigns got certified. Now, again, I want to just take away from just a one anecdotal campaign, but my understanding was that was an issue throughout, that especially with the contributions that were rejected, that number changed dramatically from the previous years. And because I've run in previous campaigns, I know that for sure for us as well. So was there a reason that happened? And then that could explain the lack of communication as to sort of how to rectify that. But I know that was a problem. And the numbers were much higher. If you have any data on that, I'd be interested to see that and why that is.
I think a large part of it is there was a fundamental shift in how the qualifying contributions are raised. Credit cards.
And did that happen last year?
Yeah.
It just happened last year.
It certainly increased a great deal, and we can get you the numbers. It's been increasing since 2018. Yeah, COVID supercharged it, but I think 70 to 75% of the contributions turned into credit card contributions in 2024. Some of the campaigns were at 100%. And what you have when treasurers are processing paper certification cards and checks is oversight. And you don't have that when they just are getting these spreadsheets. They don't go through them and look at them with the same critical eye. They just don't interact with them because they look at the bottom line, they think they're okay, upload it, and off they go. And so that's causing problems. And so that's where our IT director, who's just come in, is saying, look, we can create new tools for the treasurers. We can give them something where they can upload and they can interact with those spreadsheets and see the problems. You know, putting the buttons within their eCRIS account so that they have that option. And that's what we hope to do. But yeah, we were surprised at how much the automation on this part caused treasurers not to do the same kind of deep dive look that they would have done. And so problems that were caught by them and fixed were not. We did a lot of work after COVID to try to bring forward to treasurers, here's what you need to look for. We created a whole handout of, these are common problems and these are the fixes. Go get them now before you come in and do that training. But I think in 2024, what we started to think we were seeing is just the fact that they weren't interacting with the spreadsheets. They were just kind of looking at the number below. And so our hope is that we're going to give them a way to run reports that highlight for them, you know, these are empty, this is empty. You need to go get this answer.
I'm glad to hear that because it was very difficult and very stressful, as you can
It was
imagine.
for us too.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Like, that's why I asked that capacity. Yes. But that's good to know that there's some way to get that information out, because I can tell you have a very diligent treasurer, and for him to not know, and then to sort of follow up and not have heard back, to say, what do you want me to rectify? I have no idea why this contribution, which in a previous cycle didn't get kicked back, is not getting kicked back. Maybe again, because the rules change or a different method, but it'd be great to get that communication out. And I'm glad to hear that there's upcoming changes that might make it easier for that
Absolutely.
process to go smoothly for everybody.
The compliance unit is, we're in the job of making this voluntary program successful. That's what we do. And we are constantly, after every 2-year cycle, we evaluate what happened? Can we do it better? Sometimes we have fixes that we think are going to be it, and then people don't read our fact sheet. It wasn't as effective as we hoped. And so now what can we do? How can we do it better? And we're constantly in that process of talking to people, hearing what didn't work, why it didn't work. It's interesting sometimes, and, things happen on a broader federal level. People all of a sudden don't want to give you their contact information. So you go to their registration and it has fake information on it, and you can't get in touch with the treasurer because they've got some email that they're not checking, or, and those are problems that are increasing for us and making our jobs more difficult. But we just keep trying to figure out ways to work around it and get our communications out there.
No, thank you very much. And, very much appreciate all the work that you do. It's not easy to be a watchdog and serve that function. And I very much appreciate it. And, and I think for us, we have to balance. That's why I ask about capacity, because we have to balance the practicalities and the constraints that we're facing also financially with the important task of not reducing that oversight function, and not reducing the independence of the agency. And to that extent, how do we do all that at the same time? That's what we will talk about, but very much appreciate the work that you're doing. And thank you for your testimony and your recommendations. And as we're looking at all these bills now, again, we'll take that into consideration. So, and I don't think there are any other questions right now for you. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so we have two more speakers. So Patty Sprung. Oh, we skipped. Oh, sorry. Oh, we skipped us. Oh, because I came in late, so I didn't realize we skipped. Representative Santinella, apologies.
No worries.
Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Gadgart-Wilcox, Dathan, ranking members Sampson, Carney, and other distinguished members of the Government Oversight Committee. I'm State Representative Santinella from the 58th District in the town of Vail. I'm here today to speak in favor of SB 1406, an act concerning online platforms that collect contributions and authorizing state elections and enforcement commission jurisdiction over other elections and certain districts. In particular, I want to speak in favor of the changes being proposed in this bill to bring quasi-government entities which are created under Chapter 105 of the general statutes under the jurisdiction and oversight of the SEEC and other state agencies, including the Office of the Chief State's Attorney. Currently, entities organized under Chapter 105 have very limited oversight within the state government. Though these entities operate in many capacities as mini municipalities with the authority to hold elections, propose referendums, and levy taxes, they are currently not held to the same degree of oversight as those other organizations. In fact, there is no oversight whatsoever. And with no oversight, there is no accountability. SB 1406 corrects this hole in the statute. Central to my argument in support of this legislation is to protect the integrity of these proceedings, of the proceedings conducted by Chapter 105 entities, and to protect the voters, the integrity of voting, and taxpayers' wallets. Currently, there are no safeguards that exist which allow for the auditing, monitoring, and enforcing of voting conducted by these entities. In addition, the absence of these safeguards, there is an absence of consequences in the event of irregularities if irregularities are uncovered. SB 1406 closes a gap, a gaping loophole in our statute, and I urge that you consider this legislation. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. And we turn over to Representative Vale for first question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Representative.
Good afternoon.
Can you give examples of quasi-public agencies
So
that this
like
would affect?
So under Chapter 105, these are mostly the special taxing districts. I'm not sure if they're special taxing districts. I believe in my comments, I referred them as quasi-government
Yep.
agencies, but I think they, in many ways, they function as, they have a municipal function. And those special taxing districts are really what I'm referring to.
Okay. Are there some in Enfield? Is there,
6 of them
all right.
in our town.
in Stafford, we have, they call it a service district now who pays additional taxes as well. Is that the same type of thing?
I don't know. It
You don't
depends
know.
on,
Yeah,
it
I just-
depends on how the entity is organized by statute. They have
Okay.
their, these organizations have derived their power from Chapter 105 of the statute, and it prescribes a specific set of things that they need to do.
Okay. I'll have to dig a little deeper into this one. I appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your testimony. So how many of these special taxing districts do we have in Connecticut?
So I believe we heard testimony earlier that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 320 of them.
Okay. And are there, so is there a reason this sort of need for oversight has come up now?
Sure. So
Yeah.
I can give you a specific set of circumstances that I encountered in my recent history that may bring further context to this. On January 17th of 2009, a special taxing district in my town sent out a public notice that they were going to have a referendum to spend to get the approval of $2.4 million to purchase new equipment. There was a notice that was put in the Journal Inquirer that specified the time and the place of the meeting, and that all the voting was supposed to take place in person. The word got out that the community was not happy with this proposal and that people were going to show up and vote against this proposal. And before the election or that voting took place, members of the special taxing district went out into the community and solicited absentee votes from members of the community, which was never a provision of the public notice. There was no warning that people could vote early, that they could vote by absentee ballot. You were supposed to show up at a specific date and time and cast your vote. The people who showed up at the meeting that night defeated the measure. And after it was defeated, members of the taxing district said, oh, by the way, we have all these absentee ballots. They then incorporated those ballots into the voting mix and the measure passed. So at that moment, a provision that was never allowed to be part of the proceedings swung the vote from a negative to a positive.
And you don't want, what oversight and intervention would you want from the SEC to a policy on a potential penalty?
Yep. So Senator, we all just ran for office. And if I showed up at the 11th hour and put a number of ballots in a voting box to swing the election from my opponent to me, what would have happened to me? That's what happened here. There was never a provision that people could vote in an absentee ballot. The district manipulated the process so that they could get their measure passed. And I spent the better part of a year and a half with the Freedom of Information Commission trying to get my hands on the ballots. and it was an all-out fight. And in my testimony, I have submitted the FOI opinion, which ultimately gave me access to the ballots. And I have them here with me. And I have the ballots they are called ballots. These are the ballots of the people that actually showed up at the meeting. And the vote tally of the ballots gives you one result. And when you add in the absentee ballots, right? So I have 112 absentee ballots. Every one of them is in favor of the measure. So I don't know what the likelihood, I mean, if you ever do a canvassing of 100 people, do you get a unanimous votes? That's very unlikely in a municipal or quasi-municipal special taxing scenario. And I found this to be particularly egregious, that this could go on in plain view of everybody and there be no consequences whatsoever. I went to the extent to actually file a complaint with our police department to have this investigated, thinking that this was some sort of fraud that was portrayed upon the voters of my district. And it was taken to the state's attorney, and the state's attorney said, it's not right, but there's no law that protects the voters from this kind of behavior. And the state's attorney said, we've seen much worse. And that has just resonated with me ever since. And that's why now, having the opportunity to change the law and fill what I perceive to be a hole, I'm taking the opportunity to do so.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Your main objection, though, is that it wasn't part of the, not that there was any sort of tampering with the absentee ballot process, just that process wasn't announced as part of the process for the referendum.
That
And
is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions for you, Representative. Thank you very much for joining
No
and for
worries.
waiting and your patience
Yeah, no worries.
all that time. Thank you. Okay, I think we have Patty Sprons.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Gadger Wilcox and Representatives Dathan and Carney and members of the Government Oversight Committee. My name is Patricia Spruant and I am the president of the Connecticut Town Clerk Association. I'm also the town clerk for the town of Windham. Town clerks of Connecticut are in favor of SB 1409. Town clerks work alongside many state agencies, and it pleases us greatly when we can work together to improve procedures. To that end, we support the effort to require all campaign registration and financial disclosure statements to be filed with the State Elections Enforcement Commission via ECRIS rather than hard copies submissions with town clerks. This change in filing requirement is consistent with the current requirement for statewide candidates and their treasurers, and will afford the public the ability to view all campaign finance forms from one online portal at any time. A very successful pilot program utilizing the ECRIS system for the 2017 municipal election was performed by 20 towns. These towns, municipal candidates, and treasurers and SEEK were extremely pleased with the streamlining process in using the ECRIS recording system. Many treasurers were also treasurers for state candidates and were very comfortable using ECRIS. Consolidating the campaign finance filing regulations with SEEK will eliminate the confusion in municipal election cycle years and will provide total clarity and efficiency for candidates and their treasurers to utilize the ECRIS system. The public will also have 24/7 access to ECRIS to review campaign finance filings. CTCA supports SB 1409 and respectfully recommends the effective date of all sections to be modified to January 1st, 2027. ECRIS was quickly implemented during the 2017 pilot. With the 2025 municipal election already in process, efforts should be made to implement ECRIS for the 2027 municipal election cycle. The clerks would like to thank the committee for working in collaboration with us to improve election administration and the voting process in Connecticut. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for joining and for your testimony. With that pilot program, how many towns did you say were part of that?
20. And they chose small, medium, and large. And so they had just a very good testing group, and everyone was very satisfied with the process and the
Yeah, no,
results.
one, also thank you for all the work that you're doing, and anything to sort of help reduce, the burdens that are being placed, I think are helpful. And it was great to hear testimony that we're already looking into, these new sort of technologies to help advance
Exactly.
kind of efficiency,
Exactly.
which is
For
great.
years, we've housed them, and that's been fine. And Seek has always worked so well with us. And any questions we had, they would answer. But now we have the technology and capability of having one place, and it can be made accessible to everyone any time of the day. And it's fabulous. So we support it as well.
And were there any problems that came up in that process? I mean, what were were there issues whether that was in the larger districts or smaller districts? I mean, what were some of the highlights that were discussed after the pilot program?
So the entire program really worked very, very smoothly. I was not one of the towns of that pilot program, but the information that I received and that what clerk shared was that it worked wonderfully. And it just, now we're ready to move, all 169 towns to join in that process.
Great. And are there any towns utilizing that for 2025, or this was just a pilot program?
That was just a pilot program. And of course, we had the state election worked fine in that regard. So we would like to incorporate the next municipal election, 2027, because the current one, it would just be a difficult thing to implement because we're already in process. But for 2027, we would like to participate in having it all be submitted electronically through eCRIS.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for joining and for your testimony.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And then we have Tom. I think Tom, you're our final speaker unless there are others. Nice to see you.
Nice to see everybody. My name is Tom Swan. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Citizen Action Group, and I want to talk about a couple of bills today. I'm probably going to start off by acknowledging I have some questions as to what's the relationship between this committee and GAE committee, and particularly as we'll be testifying tomorrow on several bills before that committee. And as part of my questioning, I want to point out that this December will represent 20 years since we adopted and passed the Citizens Election Program, the first legislature to adopt such a style system. And it's something I think even people who voted against it 20 years ago, I know people that even voted against it 20 years ago, take a great deal of pride. And I think part of the reason we can take the pride is we haven't seen the level of corruption that we saw prior to that, and we haven't seen the misuse of public funds. And I think it's easy to complain about Seek. I will be one of the ones more than willing to do that from time to time, but they've actually done a really good job. And they play a really important role both in protecting taxpayers' dollars or unclaimed assets, but also in maintaining and keeping the program going. It's in that light I'm going to voice our opposition to two of the bills being heard by you today. The first is Senate Bill 1405, an act modifying campaign finance laws and the powers of the State Elections Enforcement Commission. We have not found it to be a widespread problem that people can't qualify to be a part of the system. We don't need to blur those lines and expand it so that other groups can go about raising that money for people. It's a good program. You've got to show a modicum of support, and we should make sure that that happens. We need to protect transparency in terms of the messaging and people attributing where they're spending the money. And we're also really concerned with restrictions on SEEK's ability to monitor and oversight the program. Some of the proposals in this bill and the other bill that I'm going to speak about today have been brought up before the Government Administrations and Elections Commission before, and they've been rejected for good reason. And we're not sure why. Right? I'm very confident in the chairs of this committee. I've known Representative Dathan for a long time. We've talked a few times on the phone, and the intentions, but I'm not sure some of the folks pushing behind this aren't just trying to weaken and circumvent some of the oversight and stuff related to SEEK that have been rejected before. We definitely disagree with the concept of every 4 years the legislature voting on approving or not the executive director. The independence of this is really important. And we also understand why there may be some people in the legislature that want to be able to maintain and wield more control. I just think that's a slippery slope that'll lead to trouble sooner rather than later in ways that we don't want. Also, in terms of the rejected contributions, I guess I think SEEK did a good job answering a lot of the questions. I want to go back to some of Representative Dathan's questions, not knowing exactly her consultants, but somebody who does this. There is at least one firm, and probably more, but that's notorious for trying to put forward submissions that give you no idea really how the money's spent. And part of the reason for the disclosure with the public funds, if I'm on an opposing campaign, I want to know that Representative Vale's not spending $10,000 on communications. I want to know whether or not that's communication. And I'm not suggesting that you're trying to hide this either. Whether or not that money is being spent on digital ads, on mail, on a person to do PR. And there have been some consultants that have been more notorious than others, and I don't feel like calling them out. They're trying to hide that to gain a political advantage. And I think SEEK, through pressure from also people who are on other campaigns, other consultants and legislators, have tried to push for greater disclosures in that regard in what's going on. The second bill I want to oppose is the SB 1047, the act concerning audits conducted by the State Elections Enforcement Commission. And also in one of the two bills, there's some timelines in terms of when investigations have to be complete or whatever. I think SEEK's proposal to say committees should be closed by the end of January of the following year is a reasonable one. I think that some of the ideas that they discussed for how they might be able to facilitate and move this forward is a good thing in terms of using technology and data. But I do think they're trying to place an arbitrary time limit on how long it takes to complete an investigation. And I have colleagues who are still being, I think, investigated from the time, I was in diapers. So I understand the frustration and sometimes the need to push back. But we've seen nationally with the current occupant of the White House and how easy it is for people under investigation sometimes to just beat the clock and slow things down. So in conclusion, I want to thank you for what sounded like really strong bipartisan commitment to figuring out how this works. And I think that's something that's important in these times to remember. This bill was passed by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Republican governor. And it was something that has really improved the politics here in Connecticut that I don't think anybody disagrees with, even people that don't like the idea of public financing going into it. So I'm happy that you're showing a commitment to protecting that and thinking about how we improve the system and asking questions from people who have had challenges using it. But we're really proud of this 20-year record. We want to continue to do it and look forward to working with you to figure out how everything plays between GAE and this committee, and want to just reiterate, we think they've done a fantastic job at trying to keep voters and taxpayers' interests front and center. Thank you.
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you so much for your testimony, and definitely agree with that. And being a member of the League of Women Voters, I should say that, you know, the first time I heard about the Citizens Election Program, before I got involved in politics, I thought it was remarkable that we have, you know, one of the most robust programs nationally, and that does make sure we have transparency and accountability, and really, really important. So it is a program certainly to celebrate. In fact, I would argue that we should have more awareness around it, because it's something the public doesn't really even know about fully. So can we do more to address that? But no, I very much appreciate your comments. And yes, I think, you know, I'm glad we have this committee, because part of our commitment is to that true transparency and accountability, and of course within the constraints we find ourselves in, but not to compromise on the ability for independent agencies to make independent judgments and to be true watchdogs of government and of the process in which public dollars in particular are being spent. So that's really important. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let me see if anyone says a question. No, I appreciate you being here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Now you've got the rest of it.
And are there any other? Is there anyone else here? No. So it's only a few of us in the room now anyway. So unless we want to call you back up for more questions. But thank you very much for everyone who's here who testified. And we don't need to keep the meeting open, right? We'll just, yeah. Okay. I think with that, we'll just close our public hearing. Let me just ask Representative Carney if he has any closing comments.
No closing comments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I look forward to our discussions now on all of these bills going forward. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.